Thank you, George. Yes, for me, this conference is all about risk, resilience, and reward. There was always a risk I would get the longest slot. I hope you have the resilience to see it through with me, and I hope I'm not too presumptuous to think that you might get something out of it at the end. If not, there's always lunch. Before I begin, I should say that those of you that are following this presentation closely in your handouts, that there has been a small change to the presentation. There's been an addition of 3 slides following an announcement that was made by Chuggus last week on fungicide resistance, and we want to cover that to make sure that you're fully up to speed with where we are currently. But without further ado, because I've got a lot to cover, we'll make a start. Using fungicides effectively, to my mind, involves choosing the right products and then using them at the most appropriate timings and frequency. And in each given situation that we face in different crops and for different strategies, exactly what does that mean? Well, there's a number of factors that we need to reference to. The impact of disease on yield is clearly something that we have to take into account. Quality too. We need to make sure our disease control programs are proportional to the amount of a yield response that we see. Varietal resistance and other cultural control factors need to be considered. They can increase the risk of yield loss to disease or decrease it, and we need to know exactly what impact they're going to have from the outset. Product efficacy is undoubtedly going to have a big impact on which products you choose and how we use them. But with that, we need to be making sure that we're using them in the most appropriate way. And by that, I mean using them when we need them and not outside of that period, because the more we use them outside of when we need them for yield, the more we will be selecting for resistance to that particular mode of action. But equally, we need to be, when we do use them, using them in a sustainable way. And by that, I mean using them in mixtures with other modes of action to make sure that we maintain the chemistry that we have at the moment, because there are no new modes of action due to come along, and we need to protect and use what we have as effectively as possible. Start by talking about wheat, but we're going to go, those headings are going to run through all crops that I'm going to cover today. We'll cover wheat, then barley, then oilseed rape. But just to put 2015 in context for a moment, this is just the AHDB, sorry, I nearly said HGCA, forgive me. AHDB recommended list trial data showing the yield and yield response to treatment that we've seen in each season over the last 14 years. Each bar here representing the average across all varieties in each season. And you can see it varies quite a lot from one season to the next. 2010, we had a yield response of about 0.4 of a tonne on average across all varieties at all sites. 2014, it was 10 times that amount, up at around 4 tonnes per hectare. Last year might have seemed like quite a quiet year for disease for many, but actually the yield response was very close to what we would get on average, about 2 tonnes per hectare on average. And incidentally, we had the highest yields on record in the ERL last year, topping out at, on average, 11.7 tonnes per hectare. Just thinking about Septoria for a moment. Clearly, I don't need to tell this audience that it's the biggest cause of yield loss in wheat, but it's interesting to find that it's still not fully controlled on farm. The Cereal Disease Survey looks at this every June and takes samples from across the country. And when you look at the incidence of Septoria on leaf 2 in June, on average, around 50% of crops have Septoria on leaf 2 in that period. Now, if they have that in mid to late June, that's an amount of disease that probably will have an impact on yield through July as the disease progresses. And certainly in the southwest, we had on average about 5% of leaf 2 affected. So we'd expect that to bulk up and potentially have quite a serious impact on yield. These are treated crops. This isn't untreated. This is what's actually being treated. So we've still, to my mind, got a job to do to make sure that we properly control disease in our wheat. Looking at the activity of products now, this is the protectant data from 2015. I should say most of the data from 2015 is protectant information. We have a very small amount of curative information that's been bulked together across seasons. But if we look at this is across 6 trial sites. These charts are exactly as you've seen them previously. You can read across from left to right. It's the same data set. We separate them just so that you can see the curves more clearly. If you put 8 lines on the graph, it just becomes a bowl of spaghetti. You can see on the right-hand side where we have the products with a single active ingredient, Ignite and Proline. Very close in their activity. I think we would say, though, a little bit of separation there between them this year. They're very similar in their activity, but Proline looks slightly stronger in the protectant season this year. We have Bravo in here as a single point. It's the red diamond in these charts. We use it as a litre rate as a guide to just how protectant the situation is, and also to test its activity. And you can see, well, compared to a full dose of azole, that's looking equally as strong, if not stronger, in a protectant situation. The SDHIs, Intrex, Vertizan, we've been testing these for a few years, clearly very active in a protectant situation on Septoria, and much more active than any other mode of action. Note on the right we have the mixtures, and you may see a new mixture within that we haven't tested previously. We tested Librax in 2015 to see how that compared, because there was a lot of interest in that. Librax is metconazole plus floxaperoxide. Basically, it's a Dexar using metconazole instead of epoxy. Metconazole we would naturally see as probably third in the list of azoles with activity on Septoria. I know they see it slightly differently in Ireland, but that's still where we see it in the UK. So it's perhaps slightly surprising that Librax matches up to a Dexar and actually looks to be showing very similar activity to it, given that it's using a lesser azole. That may be due to either something in that formulation, or it may be that we're dealing with Caramba may have more synergistic activity with floxaperoxide. Clearly, though, all of those SDHI azole mixtures performing very well in a protectant situation, and very similarly. If we look at the yields from those trials, usually these are a reasonable inverse of what we've seen in terms of disease control, but I think it helps to reinforce that we are seeing something slightly different between Proline and Ignite on the right-hand side here. A bit more separation there in yield. But clearly the SDHI is looking very strong, and the SDHI mixtures as well, exactly where we'd expect to see them, and very similar in their efficacy, dose for dose. We like to combine these across several seasons just to see how, to get a more robust picture. And when we do that, you'll see on the right-hand side we now have Phoenix involved. We include within these trials or these sequences any situation where we've had, with a 3-year average, where we've had 2 or more years of data, and Phoenix we had in the 2 preceding years. And you can see that matches up actually very similarly to the 2 azoles, epoxy and prothioconazole, at the dose rates that we're going to be using them at, up to 100. But clearly of the 2 multi-sites, dose for dose, you would say chlorothalonil is the more active of the 2. But the rest of that information is very similar to what we saw in 2015. Good efficacy from the SDHIs and excellent protectant activity from the SDHI mixtures. We have combined, we had a single site, actually a single leaf I think it was, in 2015 of eradicant data, so we haven't chosen to show that on its own, but we've combined it across 3 seasons to give you a 3-season average. And this is the best information we have on efficacy in curative situations. Clearly, epoxy and protheo quite similar in their activity there, but neither performing particularly well. Roughly about 30 or 35% control at a full label rate from those treatments. The SDHIs, again, looking stronger than that, and the SDHI mixtures looking good. And we often see a Vertizan Ignite looking a little stronger than some of the others in this situation. It seems that it is a combination that works quite well and has good curative activity. I'm just going to touch on what we're seeing with the azoles. I think, if you'll excuse a nautical analogy here, to look at disease resistance or changes in efficacy in any one site or season is a little bit like looking at the ripple on top of a wave to judge which way the tide's going. It doesn't really work. You need to look over a group of seasons and sites to get a good feel for just what changes are occurring. And if you do that, and that's exactly what we've done within the historic data from the fungicide performance, you see this sort of a pattern. I'm going to show you epoxiconazole protectant to start with, but we've got prothioconazole to follow and the curative information after that. If you go back over the last 9 years, it's quite clear there's been a decline in efficacy in protectant situations. The black line here represents the mean across all the sites where we had protectant data in each of those years in each group. The dotted lines reflect the highest and lowest activity that we saw in that period. Quite clearly in 2007 to 2009, on average we were getting about 90% control from prothioconazole from a full label rate of it. That dropped to below 80 in 2010 to 2012, and then in the last 3 years it's below 60% in the protectant situation on average, but in some circumstances it's better than that. Clearly the range is extending as well. We're seeing a wider range of efficacy as it declines, and that's what we would expect generally as efficacy becomes less. We get more noise in the data, more variation. If we look at prothioconazole, it's almost exactly the same pattern. We're seeing this change where we had 80 or 90% control back in 2008 or around then, below 80% now and around 60 or somewhere in that order now. Again, with that range extending. That's the protectant data. We look at curative. This is what we see, and perhaps the starker change back in 2007 to 2009, around 90% control, or 85 perhaps from a full dose of epoxy. That dropped to around 45 or 50% control between 2010 and 12, and now it's about 35 to 40% control from the last few samples that we've had. Prothioconazole, very, very similar pattern. We've seen a big change between 2007 and 2009, down to around 40 or 50% control, which is roughly what we've seen ever since about 2010. So some quite big changes going on there. And this, I should say, fits very closely with what fungicide resistance monitoring has shown. This is courtesy of Bart Fry at Rothamsted, and I think for those of you that are familiar with these, effectively each line here represents a single year, and all the dots along that line represent the sensitivity of each isolate that was tested, and effectively the lines all shift from left to right, showing that the population as a whole is generally becoming less sensitive to, in this case, prothioconazole. But I'm not going to run you through all of the different curves because they all look very similar. We're seeing exactly the same with epoxy and with other azoles generally. What does this mean? We're seeing a decline in azole efficacy. We need to be careful how we interpret that. What I've put up here is purely for illustration, although it is grounded in some degree of science. This just shows the decline in activity that we would expect as you go through a latent period. When we look at curative activity within the fungicide performance trials, we are effectively, any individual site could be 1 day curative or 2 weeks curative. We could be spraying that treatment the day after an infection event or 2 or 3 weeks later. If we see differences on that leaf as a result of our actions, we would include that leaf within the analysis. It would probably form part of it. So it's no surprise really that we see huge variation within the curative data because of just exactly what situation that particular site is in when it is treated and assessed. If we consider that when we group together a number of sites and seasons, that it's probably realistic to assume that the fungicide performance studies represent activity around the midpoint of the latent period. There'll be some either side of it, probably on average pretty close to the midpoint. That's the dotted line in the centre of this chart. At this point, I've actually linked this to the charts that you've just seen. And back in 2005, we would have expected around 85% control. That's where the top line is fixed against the dotted line there. Now, we're probably looking at nearer 40% control around the midpoint of the latent period. I think the point I'd take away from this is that generally when we apply fungicides, we apply them either immediately after a leaf has emerged, in the case of leaf 1 and leaf 3, or 10 to 12 days after a leaf has emerged in the case of leaf 2. That's generally, we're applying them, or aiming to apply them, in that first part of the latent period. So that activity that we're getting in that early phase of the latent period is more important perhaps than that we get later. And during that period, we're probably getting more than 40 or 50%, well, more than 40% control from the azoles. Now that's control that we're not going to see from any multi-site that we've added, and that control that we're getting, that activity that we're getting in that curative period is what will help to protect the SDHIs. We're going to be using them alongside SDHIs. We need to make sure that they're in there, and there's good reason for that, even though these tests sometimes show we don't get much activity because we happen to have tested them in an extreme environment. I said I was going to say something about the new races of Septoria. There has been some information coming out of Ireland in the last, well, I think they had a press release last Thursday. They have found isolates now, some of which have what is known as the CH152R mutation. This has been detected in laboratory studies and is of particular concern. It is thought to be certainly it's a step change in sensitivity compared to the isolates that we've seen so far. Exactly what size that step is, we don't know yet. There'll be a lot more information coming out. This is only preliminary information. There will be much more said about this in the coming months. The laboratory studies that have been done on this particular mutation indicate that it probably will be cross-resistant to other SDHIs. It's currently at very low frequency in Ireland, and as yet, we don't know whether it's got a fitness penalty. Clearly, if an isolate has a fitness penalty, when we remove the selection pressure, it will decline in the population. It may even disappear altogether. There have been cases of that. We don't know yet whether it will or won't stay around, and that will have a huge impact on just how much of a problem this is going forward. What I'd like to say, though, is out of this, the stewardship and the strategies we've been employing to control Septoria are correct and continue to be correct and are paramount from here on. And by that, we're talking about maximizing the other methods that we have of controlling Septoria. We want to make this product, these actives, last as long as we possibly can. So using them responsibly, using them when we need them, using multi-sites and azoles alongside them whenever possible, and possibly even using strobilurins, which still have some small effect on Septoria. But also, where possible, we should be trying to grow varieties that aren't particularly susceptible to Septoria so that we can reduce the amount of SDHI that we use in any one season, maintain yield, and save some of that efficacy for another season. Because the more we use it, the faster we will lose it. I think as Jenna mentioned earlier, we need to try and identify situations where we can reduce the input to crops. In 2014 and 2012, we saw huge yield responses to treatment because we had very high levels of disease. But that's not always the case. If through monitoring or better disease forecasting, we can identify the seasons where we don't need disease. I realise to ask anybody to, it's wonderful with the benefit of hindsight to judge these things, but if we can identify those years ahead and reduce our inputs, apply one SDHI rather than two, or none at all if at all possible, such that we aren't imposing that selection pressure where we don't need to. Because any year where we apply a fungicide like an SDHI where we haven't needed to, we're still selecting for resistance, we're still going to make that population a little bit less sensitive, but we won't have seen any benefit from it. So that was all I was going to say on that. Back to the program now. On yellow rust, we have data from 2015 as well. Quite a season 2015 for yellow rust, and quite a delayed epidemic compared to the previous season where we had a very mild open spring. Still quite a few varieties out there that are quite susceptible: Keeler, Solstice, Gallant, Cordial, to name a few, and to a lesser extent Horatio as well. We managed to get high levels in the fungicide performance trial, certainly. We actually are using Oakley still to test products to the extreme to really separate out which products are most active. And that picture is actually the fungicide performance crop at Terrington about 10 days before application, showing the level of disease that we had in there. So it was a pretty severe test. And this is what we found. Effectively, Ignite, Comet, both very active on yellow rust. They have been. We usually find Ignite a little bit more effective than strobilurins, but both have good activity. The SDHIs, interestingly, they may be very active on Septoria, but they only have partial activity on yellow rust. They're adding to the yellow rust activity that we might see from the azole partner, but they're not as active there. Notably on the left-hand side where we look at the mixtures, all the mixtures that contain epoxyconazole are very, very strong there. And in this highly curative situation, it's perhaps not surprising that Aviator is struggling a little compared to the others. When we look at yield, we see that separation between Comet and Ignite clearly has a more durable. I think it tends to be a bit more persistent in its control compared to Comet. And again, the SDHI mixtures containing epoxy looking very strong there. You can see the severity of the epidemic by the fact the untreated yield, even in a high-yielding situation, was yielding just under 3 tons to the hectare. This crop was devastated by yellow rust. Looking at brown rust for a moment, we did see a bit of brown rust at the end of last season as a result of some of the warmer days in June and July. And we inoculated trials within the fungicide performance to make sure we got it, and we did. So we have some activity on that. I'm particularly concerned about brown rust going forward if this weather continues. I was amazed to see an insect flying around here earlier. For this time of year, that's quite astonishing. It's been incredibly mild the last 6 or 8 weeks, and these are conditions very similar to what we saw in around 2007, where we had devastating brown rust that came in early and was very difficult to control for the whole season. If things continue as mild as they are, I wonder whether we shouldn't be keeping an eye out for that. Certainly in 2007, early treatments, T0 azoles, certainly had a big positive effect on controlling brown rust. If we look at activity as tested in 2015, this is what we saw. Again, Ignite, very, very active on brown rust, a really useful azole when that pathogen is around. Comet, equally very good. The SDHI is probably more active on brown rust than they are on yellow. And we did include Caramba in there because of the interest in Caramba, given Librax and its arrival in the market. And Caramba, as we saw in I think about 10 years ago when we last tested Caramba on brown rust, it doesn't appear to be quite as effective, but it's pretty close in its activity on brown rust to the others. So just to wrap up on wheat, clearly the SDHIs are the most active chemistry on Septoria. Librax clearly look to be at least as effective as other SDHI azoles. The activity of the azoles has clearly declined, but I think they're still very important in the role that they have in supporting SDHIs in curative situations. But we also need the multi-sites because they add very valuable protectant activity to all programs. And both of those are what may help us keep the SDHIs for as long as possible. On rusts, I mean, clearly epoxyconazole, it's highly active on both yellow and brown rust. And the strobilurins, more activity than the SDHIs, especially on yellow rust. Moving on to look at barley for a moment. Barley, again, a fantastic yield from barley this year. The HTCA-RL came up with the highest, AHDB-RL, came up with the highest yield that it has for many years, with a total yield, treated yield of about 10.7 tonnes, I think it was, across all barley varieties. Astonishing yield. Even the untreated actually was the highest untreated for many years as well. And actually the untreated was higher than many treatments in previous seasons as well. Phenomenal yield for barley. On average, we tend to see about 1.5 tonne yield response from barley disease control, and that's almost exactly what we saw in 2015, very close to what we call a normal season for disease. On Rhynchosporium, we had 3 sites on Rhynchosporium in 2015. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side again, you've got the products with a single active ingredient. Note there's a difference between the SDHIs on Rhynchosporium. Zulu and Vertizan have activity and good activity on Rhynchosporium, but Imtrex is stronger. Note though, Proline, still the stalwart of barley disease management programs, still very effective on Rhynchosporium and clearly a lead active still. On the left-hand side, we've got the 2 mixtures that we've been testing, Adexar and Siltra, and clearly both very active and very similar when compared as a percentage of label rate. Look across 3 seasons, it's a very, very similar picture. We can actually include Vertizan and Proline when we look across 3 seasons, and that mixture compares very similarly to what we've seen from the other SDHIs, the other SDHI mixtures in there. If we look at eradicant data over 3 years, we had a little bit of information from 2015, but we've grouped that together to give you a rounder average. Actually, it's almost exactly what we see from the protectant information. Zulu, quite separate from Imtrex, but both having good activity on Rhynchosporium. And actually, I think Vertizan Proline nestles into the rest in a curative situation. That Vertizan factor seems to improve, certainly add to Proline here. On net blotch, we had some some additional information from 2015, and again we've looked at this across seasons, but I should add we're seeing good activity from the SDHIs when we look at the average across seasons. We were seeing good activity from 2015 as well, which is reassuring because there is concern out there that there are isolates of net blotch that are now less sensitive to net blotch, to SDHIs. Does seem as yet, though, we're not seeing a change in field performance, and here certainly all of the SDHIs performing very well. Vertizan, Zulu and Imtrex nestled together very closely at the bottom there. Proline still very effective, more of a rate response there. Certainly we see an improvement by going from a half to a full label rate of Proline. But both of the 2 SDHI mixtures tested here look very strong as well. And in a curative situation, it's a very similar pattern, a very good activity from the SDHIs and from Proline. And again, Vertizan and Siltra showing the benefit of using an SDHI mixture above Proline. We've also had a little bit of information on powdery mildew in the last few years. Oddly, this isn't, as sometimes occurs, it isn't actually from the powdery mildew trial, which would have had a load of specific powdery mildew-icides in there. It's actually looking at the mainstream product. But that's quite interesting because it gives us a bit of information on just what those mainstream products will do. And actually, where mildews are concerned, Proline in itself is very useful. Even a quarter or a half dose of prothioconazole will significantly reduce the amount of mildew that we have. Note the SDHIs don't claim to have much mildew activity, but they all seem to have some mildew activity, and all fairly similar, around 50% control. So they will be adding to what we use when used in a program. We're not going to use them for mildew specifically, but they may help. On ramularia, thankfully there's many different modes of action that we can use on ramularia and various different products. On the right-hand side, Ignite's probably a little bit less effective than others, but Bravo and Proline actually overlie each other here and are both very active on ramularia. Note we have to apply these in a protectant situation generally. There's no curative activity. But clearly the SDHIs have also got good effect. Note there are no strobilurins tested here. That's because the strobilurins have no effect on Ramularia. Ramularia generally does have the G143A mutation, and therefore we're not going to see any benefit from their use on Ramularia. Of the mixtures, clearly Pontima and Adexar are very good, but Siltra seems to have the edge over the rest there, performing very, very well at a half-label rate. So to wrap up on barley, Siltra clearly has very good broad-spectrum activity. I think there are other things that match up to it, though, certainly on Rhynchosporium and net blotch, floxapyroxad-based chemistry in Adexar or Intrex, or Vertizan plus Proline, for example, will give very similar levels of activity. Proline, still in there, still a very important part of barley disease management, and still a very consistent performer. Thankfully, the SDHIs still have good activity on net blotch, which is reassuring, and there's a range of ways we can control Ramularia, the SDHIs, Proline, or Bravo, to name a few. I think just as with SDHI use in wheat, we should be trying to avoid the overuse of SDHI and azole in barley. Other mixtures are available. The strobilurins are still very active in barley diseases, and where possible we should be trying to lean on those rather than just the SDHIs. Moving on to look at rape briefly. Some photos here of some of the different diseases of rape. I'm sure you're all very familiar with them. The centre one there is actually a crop affected by Sclerotinia, what I think is probably one of the most decimating diseases that can occur in a rape crop. Thankfully, it doesn't occur that commonly. But what I'm going to show you now is really just a brief summary of the information we have on rape. There's a huge amount more information on the AHDB website that's been released over the last few weeks. So if you're looking for more data, especially over the last couple of years, I referenced you to that. Just thinking about yields and yield response in rape, actually 2015, just like with wheat and barley, was one of the highest yielding seasons within the recommended list, with yields topping out on average at just below 6 tonnes per hectare. Phenomenal. You'll note it's not that there is no yield at all when we don't treat. There is actually no untreated yield trials over the last 5 or 6 years, but we do have untreated trials between 2002 and 2010, and those trials indicated that on average we see roughly about a 0.6 of a tonne yield response to fungicides in rape trials in the RL. So plenty to chase there in terms of yield response to treatment. Just looking at some of the historic data on FOMA, up until 2014 we were looking at half and full rates of a number of different products. Not all are shown here actually because some still haven't been registered, but clearly when we look at FOMA across 8 sites over 4 years, we get a reasonable average as to what the actives are doing, and clearly actually we had a canker index in the untreated there of over 30, and Proline looked highly effective at reducing canker index to around 10 or 12. Actually, interestingly, from a yield perspective, as long as we get the canker index much below about 25 or 30, we tend not to see an impact on yield. The girdling of the stem is not sufficient to significantly affect yield. So it's about reducing the amount of disease, not necessarily completely controlling it. Proline was very effective and had good yield response in these trials, partly for the fact as well that Proline has no growth regulatory activity, so it's no surprise that the half and the full dose had a good yield. Tebuconazole or Aureus and Metcon or Sunorg Pro, they're both products that have more activity in a protectant situation, and this would have been testing protectant and curative, so it's no great surprise that they look a little bit weaker when tested in this way. Additionally, their yields and their full rate yields may have had some negative effect from the fact that a full rate of a growth regulator applied twice in the autumn and spring can have a negative effect, especially on small crops. A little bit of information from 2015. I should add this is a single site, but we are testing new products and we have a small amount of information. This was a highly curative situation, and so it's no great surprise that perhaps some of those products that we would expect to be better in a protectant situation, such as Circon, which is Propi plus propiconazole plus prochloraz, or Aureus tebuconazole, had a higher canker indices. There are a couple of new products within this, though, Refinzar and Pictor. Those of you that aren't familiar, these are actually strobilurin SDHI combinations. Pictor is dimoxystrobin plus boscalid, so Phelan plus strobilurin. Refinzar is penthioparad, so DuPont's SDHI plus picoxystrobin. And we've been testing these in exactly the same way as the other products have been tested within this trial. I say that because both of these two products have label restrictions. We can't actually apply what we've done with experimental approvals. You can't actually do that in the field. But we have done it that way so that you can see what the inherent activity of these products is compared to the others that we're testing. And I think the early data would suggest there is a bit of a rank order there in activity, that Pictor looks to be doing a reasonable job in a curative situation. Refinzar looks a little bit more active, and Proline a little bit more active than that. Moving on to look at light leaf spot. This is across 5 sites over the last 2 years. We had an additional site in Dorset this year that's added to the data set. And generally, actually, most products are doing a reasonable job in reducing the level of light leaf spot across these sites. There was some variation from one site to the next, but I think the one thing I pick out here is 2 products that often do perform well: Proline and tebuconazole, or Aureus. In this case, the green line and the yellow line on the left-hand side of the charts. They often do perform very well in light leaf spot situations. And other products, though, look to be stacking up quite similarly as well, though. Note, when you look at yield, it's no great surprise that at high rates, where you apply tebuconazole at high rates to small crops in Yorkshire and Scotland, you can have a growth regulatory effect that's adverse to yield. So it's no great shock that tebuconazole drops off a bit there in terms of its yield. But generally, I mean, most of those yields are within 0.1 or 0.2 of each other, seeing very similar efficacy from most of those products. We think light leaf spot control is probably more about timing than it is about product choice in that respect, and that we're already seeing light leaf spot out in fields at the moment means I think that we need to be monitoring that as we go into the spring, and where possible applying products well before stem extension, before that disease gets a chance to build up in crops. Thinking about Sclerotinia for a moment, this is actually some historic data going back a few years, but it's probably the best broad data set that we have. This was from Herefordshire and Kent in 2006 and 2008. Quite a lot of products that have activity. There is some differentiation within this. You'd say the strobilurins, Amistar, and with ciproconazole and Priori Extra, clearly active on Sclerotinia, as is Compass, actually, good old NBCs. But probably the most active molecules out there are prothioconazole and boscalid, and we see that in Phelan and Proline here, also in Pictor, which is within this chart, which is unsurprisingly very closely matched to Phelan. In terms of yield, with most products, actually, in epidemic seasons, we usually see a benefit from going, if you are just applying a single application, from going beyond the half-label rate. Phelan looks to be the exception there, but I'm not sure that's something I would lean on too heavily. But certainly with Phelan, the message is now that we need to be using that in mixture with other modes of action, given the concerns about new strains of Sclerotinia with boscalid resistance. That's the historic data. If we look at we did get some data from 2015 from a trial in the West. This is a single trial, but it's still out there. And I do think, it's some of the most depressing sites I saw were in 2008, looking around trials and farms where Sclerotinia affected the crop 6 to 8 weeks prior to harvest. It's just catastrophic, the impact it can have. The yield responses we've seen here around a tonne to the hectare, but this disease can half yield or worse in some circumstances. Thankfully, it's not that common, but it's certainly one, if we can use disease forecasting or any other tool at our disposal to identify what the risk of this disease is, it's one that we could really benefit from managing more effectively when it occurs. When we look at the activity that we saw in 2015, actually it's very similar to what we saw previously. Again, actually reassuring, given that in France there have been reports of boscalid-insensitive isolates of Sclerotinia. It seems that we haven't got them yet here, at least not where we've been testing. Felan, Pictor looking very good there. Proline and Pictor actually overlying in terms of Sclerotinia index. And good yield responses there from all products. You probably struggle to separate them based on that information. So, I mean, to wrap up on oilseed rape, FOMA, clearly, I think the general message we're seeing on FOMA is it's about one of the easier diseases to control in rape, perhaps. Half dose of most programs should be, of most products, generally does a decent job. You just need to make sure that they're well timed, applied soon after crop reaches threshold, and again, on reinfection. On light leaf spot, again, timing, key factor. I think we need to be monitoring that on a field-by-field basis as we go into the spring. Timing is even more critical when it comes to Sclerotinia control. Getting that right or not can have significant consequences. All products will only act in a protectant situation, so we need to be in there before we see petal fall. If we're applying just once, if you're applying twice, 3 weeks apart, applying the first treatment at early to mid-flower usually works very well. Thankfully, there are also some non-azole options available out there for FOMA and light leaf spot control, but do note the restrictions that are placed on those. And as I said, there's much more information on the AHD website on oilseed rape. Just to whet your appetites before I close, on a new development for 2016, we have just started a 3-year project with AHDB and BASF and Chuggas funding, looking to try and improve how we manage crops and to try and target our disease management more effectively to the different varieties and situations in which we're using them. This trial is at 6 sites over the next 3 years, and we're varying variety, sowing date, seed rate, and seeing just what impact they have on the fungicide programs that we require to properly control disease. We hope that this may be a step towards targeting SDHI use more effectively, and azole use for that matter, such that we can be applying them where we need them and to maximise margin over fungicide costs for growers. Thank you very much.